Thank you very much, Carol. And how many of you have heard me talk before? A couple of you, I think, yeah. And you've heard the usual presentation I do is kind of the introduction, but I was asked to do something a little different this time. So we're going to talk about some of the circumstances in which the 17th century history unfolded. And one of those is something that I had learned about a while back called the Little Ice Age. Has anybody ever heard of that? Yeah. Yeah, it's something that it doesn't get a great deal of mention in the literature, but today we're certainly well aware of issues around climate and then the related issues of weather. Just think of the news in the last 48 hours here. Everything from Yellowstone and the flooding out there. I even saw a report this morning, you know about the baby formula shortage, and the company in Sturgis, Michigan, who went back online. Well, they just had a flood, and now they had to stop production again. They have enough supplies though, but I think those kinds of interruptions in our daily life are either they're happening more frequently or we're much more aware of them and begin to see them. But historically, it's been more difficult to look at the effects of weather and climate over time because we don't have the capacity that we do today to go back and look at broad patterns of weather. So we have to ferret that out from other information. I mean, today anybody, you can go on your phone and find the weather in Timbuktu. I mean, it doesn't matter. That has enabled people to increase their awareness of the effects of weather and climate here. We know that America had been occupied long before Europeans got here. When did the Europeans arrive here? This is Dighton, so you're going to tell me about one event here. What about Dighton Rock?
Dighton Rock.
Yeah. What
Portuguese explorers.
That's right. What year? That's 15. Yeah, 1503, right? Yeah, that early, and that's an example of one European explorer that we know about today. But there were hundreds, literally hundreds of ships that came over here during the 15th and 16th century, primarily for fish, in some cases lumber, but they would come from the Basque Coast in northern France and come over here and spend months here, but they didn't colonize, and that's what changed in 1620, where the group came with women and children with the intention of staying and making a home here. So that was quite different. We do have some archaeological evidence. There are clues in terms of what went on in terms of climate and weather over time, but that's not all that helpful when it comes to understanding the particular events in a particular place. So the Pokanoket people, by the way, I should mention, we talk about Pokanokets, so who do you usually associate with Native Americans in this area? Wampanoag, right. Why is that? Because they've been telling you that for 200 years, okay? But if you go back and look at the early history and the maps and the documents, it was clearly Pokanoket territory here, okay? That name Wampanoag didn't get introduced till later in the 18th and 19th century, partially in an attempt to get rid of the name Pokanoket. Why would you want to expunge the name Pokanoket from this area? What happened during the King Philip War in 1675? Everything was burned, okay? 25 towns were leveled, okay? It was a terrible war. And following wars like that, people want to erase the memory. And they erased the Pokanoket people by forcing them out, enslaving them, killing them. So there weren't any native people speaking Pokanoket languages here. But it doesn't mean that the tribe itself disappeared. They merged in with other tribes, were held in a reservation in Shetucket, eastern Connecticut, and have survived through their families and are here today. And the tribe is alive and well, and the Sagamore lives in Barrington. Okay, so there's a lot more to learn about this history and the accurate story of what happened here, because Usamiquan, who we hear of as Massasoit, that was his title, not his name. It was Yellow Feather, and he was the one who walked 42 miles up to Plymouth to meet with the English separatists there and signed a treaty that guaranteed that neither would harm the other and really ensured the survival of the English. So we of European descent, you're genealogists, right? I presume everybody has some connection with Europe at some point in time. Well, that connection was ensured by Usamiquan and the Pokanokets in ensuring their survival. And the English population continued to rise during the 17th century. Native population got smaller and smaller, and finally Philip, or Metacomet, said, if we don't go to war and drive the English back, we won't exist. Okay. So that's a little bit of Pokanoket history there. But they didn't keep records of weather either. They kept records on wampum belts, but of historic events, but not weather. The tribe occupied this entire southeastern area here. Okay, this is Pokanoket country. Over 60 tribes, bands, and sub-tribes. The area that they occupied, though, was called Soams, and I passed out around a brochure about discovering Soams, and I hope you'll take some time in the future to go discover Soams. It's right in your backyard here, and there are over 50 locations that we've identified. But the reason people were living here is the same reason you're living here, which is? I was born here. Okay. Well, then the people, your parents, whoever moved here first, okay, no matter how far back you go, some European moved here, and they occupied native territory because the people who had been living here for 10,000 years, they knew all the best places to live, okay? Most of the English American towns are located on native soil, places where they had settlements because they had discovered the best places to live. Makes sense, huh? And the southern area, this is the Bristol Peninsula here to orient you. Here we are up here, but this whole area was known as a very rich and vibrant area, not only because the climate was milder here, but because of access to water. That's how people traveled for most of the last 10,000 years. We get on 195 and think, oh, we've got it made here. But in fact, most travel was not on foot. They didn't have horses, they didn't have wheels with carts and things of that sort. And the paths that they had were rugged and difficult to traverse. Much easier to get into a mashoon or a canoe, if you will, a hollowed out log canoe, and paddle your way just about anywhere in this area. And you can see why not only transportation was much easier here, but also access to food, fish, okay, clams, you know, all of this. Wonderful place to live. So if you're living here, you pick the right place. You pick the place that people who have lived here the longest have picked. So during the 17th century, people decided to leave Europe, and we know a lot about their journey, but not a whole lot about the weather that they encountered when they arrived. There is some information from written records, and we know that the Pilgrims encountered a brutal winter that first year. Half of them died, mostly, pneumonia and other if you will, weather-related illnesses. Remember, they stayed on the ship because they couldn't establish a town and take care of people that way. So it was amazing that anybody ever survived. We have any Pilgrim descendants here? Yeah, I figured if you know the story. I don't need to tell you. But the question is, was that weather, that brutal winter, typical of the time? And was it what they expected to find in terms of weather? Let's go back to Europe, where they started from. And this period known as the Little Ice Age during the 17th century found that temperatures were extremely low in much of Europe and really also the eastern United States. You've seen paintings, the Dutch Bruegel paintings, people skating. I was just in Amsterdam about a month ago. Nobody skates in the wintertime there because it doesn't freeze over there, okay? It's a mild climate, very temperate. But back then, it did. How many people remember the Narragansett Bay freezing over? Yeah. You have to go back a ways, don't you?
No. In the 70s,
Okay.
I live on Prudence Island,
Yeah.
and the Coast Guard had to break the ice for
There you go.
a ferry to get through.
I moved to Newport in 1975, and they had just had a terrible winter then.
Yeah.
And the bay ice was frozen over, but not much since, has there? I can only think of one time, and that wasn't the whole bay. It was just, some portion of that, right. So that's one way of understanding how weather and climate has been changing here. You have to have a long memory, but that's the way people recorded what they saw as what was happening in Europe. They would remember.
There's a house in the very northern part of Swansea, near the Barrington line. They moved the house from there over to Prudence on the ice.
Oh, okay, there you go. So you had to have solid ice to move a house. Right. And there's talk, and there's disagreement about whether that ever happened, but the First Baptist Church that started down in Tyler Point was moved on the ice up to its current location, not the same building, but so people could move things in the wintertime because it was that cold, okay? Ice was so prevalent that even the Inuit, of the Eskimos, if you will, from Finland and northern reaches were coming down to as far south as Scotland because they couldn't fish and the ice was too thick. So it was an interesting time. In Europe, you had glaciers in the Alps that were descending, and glaciers move. We don't think of them as moving, but they do. And they were coming down into towns and literally crushing the houses there. Okay, people had to move out because their house was now under a sheet of ice. So that had not happened in people's recollection. Over here, native bands tribe together, and the Iroquois do talk about declining food supplies during that time. But that's just remembered history, a little bit of story without details. They didn't keep accurate records of temperature and things of that sort. So what explains all this? 17th century had many famous people. Okay, I love the 17th century. You know, you had Rembrandt painting there. You also had Galileo, and you had people doing observations for the first time because they had telescopes. That's when telescopes were invented. And of course, what you do is you look at things. Of course, you look at stars at night, but by using a smoked glass, you could look at the sun. Okay, and what did they begin to see on the disk of the sun? Sunspots. All right? That's not new to us. We look at them all the time, and we know that there's a whole pattern of how sunspots cycle over a period of about 11 years. But what was very strange was in 1645, the sunspots totally disappeared. Couldn't see any more on the sun. Interesting. That was followed by a cold period. They reappeared again in 1715, And we've had sunspot cycle, 11-year cycles ever since. But that was one period called the Maunder minimum, in which there were no sunspots. Okay? That coincided with this cold period in Europe. There are theories, but nobody can explain exactly how that works. You would think that if there were sunspots, the sun would be cooler at the time. But what we observed is that when there were no sunspots, the radiation from the sun was actually lower at that time. So a reduction in the amount of sunlight reaching the planet led to a weaker equator to pole heating difference. You have to understand that weather changes in many places on the planet, and when things get colder in one place, they get warmer in another place. Wind drive a lot of weather, particularly in Europe. Does anybody know what's going on today in Europe weather-wise? I was just with some people from England a couple days ago. Very hot. Okay, they're up in almost approaching 100 degrees in Spain and France, and now moving into Germany. England's spared a little bit, but there's this big red blob, if you will, moving across, because the winds blowing up from the Sahara are bringing all that hot temperature up there. So Europe, which has, I just read today, only 5% of homes in Europe have air conditioning. 90% of homes in the US have air conditioning. Yeah.
And New England is exactly like Europe in that regard. The rest of the country, central air is standard. When I moved to New England, I was like, oh my. Pray for Europe.
Yeah, right.
I'm serious. It's terrible. When
It is. And
you're used to central air and like the dry heat and all of that, and then you come to a place where it's just not in the infrastructure.
Yep.
I really don't know what they're doing in Europe right now. That's got to be.
Well, in I think 1973, more than 20,000 people died of heat exposure. Yeah, it's not. You're right. It's not good. Yeah. They used to grow. You'll see in a minute. They used to grow grapes in England, and then they stopped because it got cold, and now it's getting warm again. So the grapes are moving north. And if you're a farmer, that's not good news, right? So the results of the Maunder minimum began to reconcile the long-standing dilemma of how solar output could have been very small and yet led to much colder climates in Europe and Eastern North America. And if you look at this, here's the chart of the Maunder minimum, 1660, the temperature goes way down, and since then it's been averaging much higher, but we have not seen the cold now that Europe experienced then. It changed New England history in ways that we're only beginning to understand, and scientists don't agree on what caused it, but most agree that the climate cooled from the latter portion of the 15th century, right near the end, to the middle of the 19th century, with the greatest intensity being between 1550 and 1700. So this is a factor. You can read all kinds of things about history, but nobody talks about the weather, and it was an important factor in that. Some scientists peg the coldest period more narrowly, 1645 to 1715, and during that period the average winters fell 2 degrees, and you think, well, what's 2 degrees? Well, that's an average. It takes a lot of low temperatures over time to bring the average down by a couple degrees, and 2 degrees Celsius is almost 4 degrees Fahrenheit too. So here we are with the Little Ice Age, this period when the temperatures dropped. Notice that during the medieval period and during the Roman period, 2 periods of expansion in population, the temperature was much higher at that time. And when you get higher temperatures, it's easier to grow food. When you get low temperatures, some extreme lows, the the amount of food you can grow drops so much that people die of starvation, and that's exactly what was happening then. There's a book called Global Crisis by Jeffrey Parker, in which he looks at the effects of climate worldwide. This wasn't just happening in Europe, but all the way across to Japan. There was a huge famine in China during that same period of time, when millions of people died of starvation because they couldn't grow enough food. And we, unless you've lived in a place that has suffered famine, it's very hard for us to understand what that's like. We're used to, we get upset when there's a shortage of potato chips or something. The fact that we have such a global infrastructure and the ability to not only raise food but to store food for years, and our manufacture of food that is shelf stable. So, anything from canned fruits and vegetables and things of that sort, and frozen foods, okay? We have stabilized our food. So even right now, the unfortunate situation in Ukraine of their not being able to move the grain that they've grown is causing problems in other parts of the world because they don't have that stability in that regard. And keep in mind, this can happen to us as much as anybody else. Okay. So let me just read a little bit from the from Fagan's book on the little ice age here. Throughout Europe, the years from 1560 to 1600 were cooler and stormier, with late wine harvests and considerably stronger winds than those of the 20th century. As climactic conditions deteriorated, a lethal mix of misfortunes descended on a growing European population. Crops failed and cattle perished by diseases caused by abnormal weather. Famine followed famine, bringing epidemics in their train. Bread riots and general disorder brought fear and distrust. Almost invariably, the frenzy of prosecutions coincided with the coldest and most difficult years of the Little Ice Age, when people demanded the eradication of the witches which they held responsible for their misfortunes. Okay, today we have all kinds of theories about why climate and the weather has changed, and obviously the most prevalent theory is that who's causing our global warming? Is it sunspots? We don't think so. Okay. The prevailing theory is that it's man-made global greenhouse gases that are cooling the planet and causing a temperature rise throughout the entire world, along with sea level rise, partly related to more carbon dioxide in the air. I mean, it's not just warmer seas are higher, but they also absorb a great deal of carbon dioxide. And so we understand climate change differently than people in the 17th century. Most theories about what happened in the 17th century are related to what? God. Okay, God is punishing you if you're having a bad time. God is looking upon you with good favor if things are going well. That was the chief way to understand these phenomenon. So if things are going badly, God must be punishing you, and sometimes it's people who call upon God to make that happen, and thereby people were accused of witchcraft. And as we know in Salem and the latter portion, that can really get out of hand, can't it? So there's substantial historical evidence. Baltic seas froze over, pack ice extended far south into the Atlantic, and winters were bitterly cold and summers were cool and wet. So we know in Europe what was going on. Widespread crop failures, snow line dropping out of the mountains, and increased levels of social unrest. When you take food away from large numbers of people, they're not happy, okay? And they make their unhappiness known by violence. And that's what was going on frequently throughout the 17th century in Europe. In fact, they've only recorded 3 years where there was no outbreak of war during the 17th century in Europe, okay? 3 years. The rest of the time, 100 years wars, 30 years wars, all this attempt to deal with the kinds of suffering that people were experiencing. Prices of grain increased. Wine, as we were talking about, became harder to grow. Fishing was affected. They had to go further and further south. Well, that's one thing if you have a huge, the kind of fishing boats we have today with diesel engines and can go thousands of miles. If you're in a boat that is dependent on wind and sails and sometimes oars, you can't go that far. And you can't get that many fish in the boat and get it back. So that was becoming much more difficult to accomplish. And the regions who did diversify because they had trade did better. So places like London did better than people living in the countryside because there were ships coming in with food that could be sold. You need a financial base to develop these technological responses, and the financial base came from trade largely. So moving to New England and what was going on here, we see that we expect to see the climate, because we're actually further south in terms of latitude from England. You would expect as you go further south, you're going to have warmer temperatures. Is that the case here? No. In fact, we have harsher winters and hotter summers than you'll find in the British Isles. And the pilgrims who came here were expecting a warmer climate, and they end up in one of the coldest winters they ever experienced. And it was the variation. It wasn't just cold winters, it was extremely hot summers. So you had both extremes going on. They wrote about some of their experience, but mostly complained that the winter was hard. It actually did improve. The rest of the winter of that first year, when they were recovering, wasn't quite as bad. It was the December that really got them. But by February and March, it was more cold and rainy than it was snowy. So 1623, a couple of years later, there was a nearly disastrous drought, but of course it was ended by a day of humiliation and prayer. Always works. If you don't like the weather, go pray, okay? There was a whole attempt during this period of time to influence people from England to move here, okay? There was a sales PR campaign going on, and William Wood was one of them in New England's Prospect, where he wanted to talk about how wonderful the weather was here. He talked about a mild season, a little frost in 1629, 1630. Remember the Great Migration came in 1630. 1,000 people came over on 100 ships. Just unbelievable in terms of the numbers of people who came here. And Wood was trying to influence that, telling people in London, you don't like how things are here, not only the weather, but the politics here. Come to America. We're going to start all over again, all right? And he argued that the winter, though sharp, was not too long to bear, okay? Trying to dispel the notions that, because there was a lot of communication back and forth. I know it took 2 months for the ships to go, but you remember that most of the early settlers were not only literate, everybody could read, because they had to in order to read the Bible, but they were printers and publishers that books were published in London within a year after people got here, describing the conditions here. And people in London were very interested and wanted to know as much as they could about this. Later, it's 45, 46, another hard winter, and by 42, remember this is when the worst of the cold was coming in. It was extraordinary cold. And then in the spring, if the weather weren't bad enough, they had an attack of caterpillars, which were, of course, seen as a sign from God that you had sinned and you need to repent, so that was the pattern all the time. So Wood was trying to promote settlement and wrote that 1637 was so hot that newcomers died of the heat, and Winthrop was forced to travel at night. So that wasn't so good by that point in time. The hot summer was followed by the hard winter of 1637, in which snow lay up to 3 feet in depth in midwinter. What happened in 1636? I'll give you a clue. It was a guy who started Providence. Roger Williams, okay. You know his story. He got in trouble. He was one of the people in London that wanted to come to America because London was terrible. He grew up in Smithfield. I don't know if you know that neighborhood. It was just outside the gates. It's where they brought in all the animals and slaughtered them. Well, they didn't just slaughter animals, they slaughtered humans there too. And he lived within a few blocks of the place where they were, burning people alive, okay? Imagine being a 6-year-old and seeing that and smelling burning human flesh. It's not a great place, okay? He wanted to leave, and he heard stories about America. And when this great migration happened, he said, sign me up, I'm going. And got on a ship and came to Plymouth in 1631, and spent 2 years there as not really a preacher, as more of an educator, but in any case, he began to talk about things that people didn't want to hear about, that maybe the state should be one entity and the church should be another one, and the two shouldn't be together, separation of church and state, radical idea then, okay? Well, they got rid of him out of Plymouth, so he went up to Salem, tried the same thing there, okay? The authorities in Boston did not like what he was talking about, and they wanted him out. So they got a group together of troops, got a ship ready to take him in January of 1636. Very hard winter, okay? Roger gets word of that and walks from Salem all the way down, not to Providence, okay, to Swansea, okay, where Usamequin had his winter settlement. You can go to the place that he was recovered from the pneumonia he's certainly had after that trek, a place called Margaret's Rock. I don't know if anybody's been there. This is what it looks like. I do tours there. If you're interested, let me know. I'll sign you up for the next one. But that's, as far as we know, the place where Roger Williams was sheltered, and we think that it was actually part of a winter encampment there. Remember, in the wintertime, the native people, the Poconoquets, would move away from the coast, and this was a sheltered place where they could get access to water and still be able to go on good days and go and fish. So you can see this location today where we think Roger was kept, as he describes, for 14 weeks while he recovered. He recovers, and then Usamequin says, I got a great spot for you. Why don't you go up to Omega Pond, okay? It wasn't a pond then, it was an inlet on the Seekonk River in East Providence. Anybody been there? Probably not, because it's terribly marked. It's on Roger Williams Avenue in East Providence. But we're going to get a new marker put up there shortly to tell the whole story there. But he sent for his family, started planting his crops. Of corn starts coming up, and the next thing, you know, the Plymouth authorities tell him he has to leave because he's in their territory. So that's when he makes the famous crossing over the Seekonk River, ostensibly to meet Canonicus of the Narragansetts, and was given land there. He was actually given land that Usamiquan owned. It was really Pokanoket land he was given, but yeah.
Did they feel bad for him, the Indians?
Did
Did the Indians feel bad for him?
Well,
Is that why they were being so nice?
you know, Roger talks about how much more Christian the native people were than the English people, okay? Because they always took care of people. They had no poverty. They did everything collectively and took care of anyone. And they welcomed people. That welcoming of the pilgrims was not something unusual. They welcomed people. That was their culture. And to take Roger in, even in the wintertime when food supplies were short, and take care of him, that was something they did. And that's what he often wrote about, was how welcoming and hospitable people from the Pokanokets were. So Roger did survive, and therefore we have Providence and Rhode Island and separation of church and state in the country. You can put all that together. See what weather does to change history here. John Winthrop from Mass Bay Colony also reported the winters were cold and unprecedented. Again, the bay was frozen to sea as far as one could discern, and so thick that horses and carts could be. It was also that cold further south in Chesapeake. And I remember people in Boston use the islands a great deal. We always think, oh, they must, you know, Boston was like today. Well, it's not. It had one little neck. It was just a little island, if you will, in the bay there. And they occupied most of the islands because you could get to them by water. It was much easier than trying to move somewhere with a cart on roads that didn't exist. So here's a challenge. The problem, simply stated, is that New England should not have been so cold. Here we are. Here's Europe at 50 degrees north, and Cape Cod at 40 degrees. Common sense told the settlers that being closer to the sun, they understood that, that it must be warmer here. So when they were forced to face conclusive evidence that New England was actually colder in the winter than England, the possibility loomed that America was fundamentally defective. Okay? Could have ended everything right there. They could have all gone back and said, forget that place. Well, they didn't understand the Gulf Stream and how England is actually warmed by the waters in the Caribbean. Okay? And it's that Gulf Stream that keeps this whole region. Anybody been to Iceland? Yeah. I was there a couple times in the last couple months. You fly through Reykjavik on the way. Stayed there once for 5 days. It's a beautiful place. You should definitely take advantage if you can get there. But Iceland is about 45 to 55 degrees year-round. Okay, it doesn't really get that cold and doesn't ever get that warm because they have this pump of water that keeps them in that condition the whole time. And of course, England and Ireland also benefit by that, and even parts of Northern Europe. So just because you're further north doesn't mean it's necessarily colder. Some people believe that the American climate was already changing as a result of civilization. William Wood thought he saw evidence as early as 1634 that rainfall patterns were changing, and argued that New England's weather was as England had formerly been. In other words, when you bring people in and cultivate, cut trees down, have farms, that you change the weather. That was the theory anyway. He reported Indian testimony that weather was better since the arrival of the English. freer from lightning and thunder, long drought, sudden and tempestuous dashes of rain and lamentable cold winters. Well, Wood was, remember, trying to sell a bill of goods to Europe about how wonderful America was. Yeah.
Yeah, but is that true? Because wasn't the Oklahoma Dust Bowl
Oh.
man-made? Wasn't that
the-
because of things that they had
I don't know that
to
anyone would say that the weather was man-made. What they would say is that having so much land under cultivation made that land vulnerable to the drought and the winds. And they lost enormous amounts of topsoil then. I mean, literally farms are just stripped back then. But it was a combination of farmland that we plowed up so much grassland in America. It was unbelievable. The millions of acres that went from a grassland turf that's very tough. If you've ever tried to plow into, it's not easy because that turf is very tough on top and it forms a protective layer. You plow that and expose the dirt underneath, and then you dry it out and you blow across it, you're in trouble. Okay, and that's what happened during that time.
worry about the Amazon rainforest.
Yes,
Cutting it.
you have good reason to be worried about the Amazon. Yeah, and other places in the world. I mean, we as we strip the land of what's naturally there, we expose ourselves to all kinds of environmental problems. Edward Johnson wrote that cutting down the woods and breaking up the land caused a marked change in the weather, but the apparent end of the extreme cold that the earliest settlers had known, it's easy to see how New Englanders could believe that European occupation was changing the climate for the better. So it's a matter of how you want to look at things. So Johnson claimed that more than the breaking of one dry spell, he argued that God was changing the fundamental climate of New England in order to make it hospitable. Okay, that's the same rationale. Remember the Great Dying, 1616, 1619, when as many as 90% of native people along the coast died of, we don't know exactly which illness, but may have been several. So that when the colonists arrived here in 1620, they found Patuxent or Plymouth empty with bones on the ground because people weren't enough people alive to bury the dead. And what was the explanation? Was it scientific? Oh, this must be an infectious disease? No. What's that? God prepared the way, and that's what they wrote. The sense of accomplishment in changing the climate ended as New England's weather in northern Europe was plunged into the worst decade of the Little Ice Age. So Increase Mather was said, described 1680, 1681 as one of the coldest for 40 years. And the winter of 84, 85 was also cold. Boston Harbor frozen so that 900 people went to Castle Island and back on the ice. Okay, you have to take a boat now. So the harsh 1630s and harsher 1640s are followed by more temperate climate in the 50s and 60s, and much of the 1670s was also moderate. Extremely harsh winters destroyed the first colony that was in Maine. There was an attempt to colonize in Maine that failed, but it failed primarily because of the weather, the Popham colony. And they, after spending a horrible winter there, they left. They said, we're not doing this. And 1607, so that was roughly the same time that the settlement was tried in Virginia as well. And Fernando George recalled that all his hopes about starting a colony here had to be laid to rest. And even John Smith, who did a lot of exploring along the coast, published the first maps. He's the guy who named New England, and he saw New England as cold and barren and mountainous and a rocky desert. Well, if you go up to Maine, there's some places that kind of look like that. The French failed to colonize further inland in St. Croix. Began to snow. 35 men died of a hideous, mysterious disease, probably scurvy, and they moved to what is now Nova Scotia. And had the weather not been so severe, New England might be New France today. Huh? Would you like to speak French? Huh? So other weather events, a hurricane of 1635, nobody talks about that. Blew down houses and forests, flattened all the corn on the ground, extremely harsh winter, and in 1636, colonists from Connecticut seized Indian corn. They were so hungry. There was the hurricane also caused shipwrecks along the coast. Both these ships had to wait out the storm, but one of them actually ended up sinking. It tore the angel Gabriel from its anchor and reduced it to rubble. So these are, you have to go looking for weather-related events in the historical record. They don't pop out, and people aren't writing about this back then. In Virginia, as we mentioned, droughts were also a great problem, and the attempt to colonize failed on several occasions. They had a lot of problems. The way they would get people to come to Virginia was to advertise for single guys who wanted to make a fortune, okay, quickly, all right? Well, of course, you got all the detached guys who don't really have a way of making any money at all. Put them on a ship and send them over, and they refused to work when they got here, okay? Didn't work out well. Droughts in Virginia, corn withered, conditions were just as bad as when the English sailed into the Chesapeake Bay, and the tree ring analysis really underscores the fact that there was a 7-year drought then. That's what they were facing. You know, when you're in the middle of a drought, you don't think this is unusual. You think this is the way it is all the time, and you just make do. But had they arrived either prior to or after, things would have been much easier. Cold winters as well. Ice on the river froze, so they took out frozen fish. I thought that was kind of clever, right? You know. And the King Philip's War, just to wrap up here, 1675-76, and there's all kinds of books about what would have caused, what led up to the King Philip War. And you can read about John Sassamon and his murder and the trial after that and one thing or another. So the whole book's written on the causes. Nobody mentions the weather, okay? But the cooler climate during that 1675 summer meant that there was less food available, and the native people were dependent on their crops, corn, beans, and squash. So when they were growing less food, they had less to store for the winter. So by January or February, even though they had been very successful in the first few months of the war, they began to have great difficulty. And Benjamin Church rallied, got some other native people on his side. He changed his whole method of warfare. No more the march down the street and, you know, fire your gun on command. It was more guerrilla warfare. And they began to get the upper hand. And meanwhile, the native people were running out of food and ammunition. So the war could have gone the other way were it not for the weather. Unusually cold winter, 75, 76. Met a comet of the Poconokeets, saw his people starve. And the swamps, you know about the Great Swamp Fight, the Narragansett, you know, where they were gathered in on an island, which normally in the swamp meant that it was very difficult for anyone to attack you because they had to go through the water. Well, it was cold and the water froze. So the English troops, when they came in, had no problem getting there and ended up burning over 400 men, women, and children alive. Yeah.
If there had been no colonists, the Native Americans still would have had a tough time because of the weather.
Well, yes, but they've had tough times before.
And they've endured them.
Yeah. We have no indication that the people who lived here ever suffered a major famine. You know, there weren't die-offs, there weren't skeletons in heaps and things of that sort. There's plenty of evidence when there's a major famine in an area of people dying suddenly in large numbers. That never happened to the native people here. So as far as we know, they've been living successfully here for 10,000 years. We've been here about 400 years. How are we doing? Benjamin Church was able to massacre them. The colder weather also suited a particular version of the malaria mosquito, so that created problems not only here but particularly in the Chesapeake area in Virginia. And people who were bitten, people would die in scores. And again, these are native people who are dying. They would certainly have religious explanations for things, but in some respects, they didn't blame one another, let's put it that way, whereas the English tended to look for a person who caused it. So the colonists defeated the native population here. Many were sold into slavery or killed or driven out. And Plymouth colony lost 8% of its adult male population during the war. It's a terrible war. And we don't even tell kids about it in school. I mean, it's the bloodiest war on a North American continent ever, and it hardly gets any mention, right? Later on, in weather events, the worst one was in 1816, the year without a summer. 6 inches of snow fell in June, and every month of the year had a hard frost, okay? They couldn't raise a thing, okay? Imagine what you'd think if you're a farmer and it's snowing and cold and nothing's growing. What are you gonna do? That was the 1800 and froze to death or poverty year. Fortunately, it didn't last into the next year, and was related to an eruption in Indonesia. Okay, when you have these large volcanoes, they dump ash and it covers the atmosphere and the temperature drops. So here's a volcanic eruption in Indonesia, and people are starving to death in 1816 here, okay? So climate is not a neutral factor in either war or peace, and it's not likely to be any kinder to us in the future, okay? So, any questions? I'm between you and lunch. Not a good place to be.
So is that considered something that would be as important as these areas that you're marking?
The reason we chose Somes is that was known as the settlement for Osamequin. There were native people all over the place, and they were connected. Remember that earlier map of the Pokanoket Nation that goes all the way up to the Charles River in Massachusetts.
So were they Pokanoket people here?
They were
also?
they were Pecasset,
Pecasset.
yeah, but they paid tribute to Osamequin, which meant that they were the government that the native people had was not an elected group. It was mostly family relationships and people who accepted the leadership of a particular person. And there were people who didn't accept Osamequin's leadership. And in fact, there are people today who said he made a big mistake by inviting the English in, but he was trying to fend off the Narragansetts who wanted to move into this territory. And the English had guns, and it worked. I mean, he kept the Narragansetts out, but over time things got worse and worse. Yeah, but yes, the native population all around this area, the Sikanat and Seekonk areas. They're not in Solms, and that's why we didn't include them. But a portion of Swansea is in that, right? And by that virtue, Somerset too, because Somerset's 1790 or so? Yeah, so it was all part of, yeah, the same thing. Thank you very much.